Don't bring your wheelchair to our house. It ruins the photos. Those were the words my son-in-law laughed as he leaned back in his leather chair, glass of wine in hand, while the rest of the family chuckled nervously. My daughter didn't even look at me. She lowered her eyes as if embarrassed, but not by him, by me, by my chair, by my existence. I sat there, silent, the metal armrests cold beneath my hands, my heart heavy with the kind of pain that doesn't make a sound. I had raised a daughter, held her through fevers, stayed up through her exams, and later walked her down the aisle after her father had passed. And yet here I was, treated as if I were nothing more than a blemish on the background of their perfect life. Let me introduce myself. My name is Clara Williams. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life, I considered myself strong. I grew up on a farm, worked hard, raised a family, and alongside my late husband, Daniel, built a home that stood as a symbol of everything we sacrificed for. We were ordinary people, but our house, the one on Maplewood Lane, was more than brick and timber. It was our memory keeper. Every birthday, every Christmas, every quiet Sunday afternoon sat inside those walls. But age is not a gentle thing, and 2 years ago my body forced me into this chair. Arthritis crept into my bones, making each step a war, and eventually the wheelchair became less of an option and more of a necessity. I thought my family understood. I thought they saw it as a symbol of endurance. How I kept showing up, kept living, despite the pain. But to my son-in-law, it was nothing more than an eyesore, something that ruined his carefully curated image of success. That night was supposed to be a simple dinner. My daughter, Rachel, had invited me over, saying they wanted family photos with the grandchildren. I dressed carefully, brushed my thinning silver hair, and brought along the little box of chocolates I'd bought with my pension. The kids loved sweets, and it made me happy to bring something small, something thoughtful. But from the moment I rolled through their polished doorway, I knew I wasn't welcome. Kevin, that's my son-in-law, barely glanced at me. He was too busy swirling his wine, talking about his promotion at the firm. His voice carried through the room, all bravado and pride. When the camera came out, I maneuvered my chair to the side, not wanting to block anyone. That's when Kevin smirked, leaned toward Rachel, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't bring your wheelchair to our house. It ruins the photos." The room froze for a second, then laughter trickled out, forced and awkward. Rachel let out a weak chuckle and looked away. No one defended me. No one said, "That's cruel." I smiled faintly, but inside, something cracked. I'd always thought cruelty came in shouts, in slamming doors, in angry words. But in that moment, I learned the deepest cruelty can come wrapped in laughter, in dismissive smiles, in silence from the very people who should protect you. Dinner blurred into a haze after that. I remember pushing away the food, my stomach too knotted to eat. The grandchildren, sweet as ever, didn't notice the tension. They climbed onto my lap, oblivious to the disdain in their father's eyes. I kissed their hair and held them close, but my heart was heavy. Every bite of food Kevin chewed felt like an insult. Every clink of his glass a reminder that in his eyes, I didn't belong. When I wheeled myself out that evening, I paused by the doorway, looking back at the house. The light spilled from the windows, warm and golden, but I felt like an outsider peeking into someone else's life. My daughter hugged me quickly, distracted, and Kevin merely waved. My chair squeaked against the pavement as I made my way to the cab, his words echoing with every turn of the wheels. "You ruin the photos." That night, I sat by my window and stared at the moon, replaying it over and over. I wondered when exactly I had gone from being a mother to being a burden, from being a cornerstone to being clutter. Daniel would never have allowed this. He had loved me fiercely, protectively, And even in our hardest days, he never once made me feel small. His absence weighed heavier than ever that night. And yet, beneath the ache, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. A memory. Daniel had been meticulous about his affairs, always planning, always ensuring I was taken care of. He used to say, "Clara, when I'm gone, you'll never have to beg anyone for a roof over your head. This house will always be yours." At the time, I had brushed it off, more focused on the years we still had together. But now, sitting alone with the taste of shame in my mouth, I began to wonder, what had Daniel left behind for me? What had he written, tucked away, that I didn't yet know? Kevin thought I was powerless. Rachel thought silence was easier than standing up for her mother. But they had forgotten something important. I wasn't alone when I built my life. Daniel had stood beside me for 40 years, and he had left me more than just memories. The wheelchair didn't ruin the photos. Their cruelty did. And I was about to remind all of them, that this old woman still held more power than they ever imagined. Family. That word used to mean everything to me. When Daniel was alive, our lives revolved around it. Our house wasn't just four walls. It was a gathering place, a heartbeat. Birthdays filled the living room with balloons and laughter. Christmas lights twinkled across the porch, and Sunday dinners stretched long into the evening. Daniel and I would sit back, watching Rachel and her friends run through the halls we had painted together decades earlier, feeling like the luckiest parents alive. But somewhere along the way, the meaning of family started to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It was small things at first. Rachel calling less after she married Kevin, excuses for why they couldn't come over for dinner, subtle changes in her tone, in the way she deferred to him before making even the simplest decisions. Kevin Hayes. I knew from the first time I shook his hand that he was a man who valued appearances above substance. His smile was perfect. Too perfect. The kind that didn't reach the eyes. He worked in finance, always talking about mergers and market trends, as though the rest of us were supposed to be impressed. But what unsettled me most was the way he looked at me. Not with warmth, not with curiosity, with dismissal, as though I were a relic from a time that no longer mattered. When Rachel first introduced us, Daniel had leaned over later that night and said quietly, "He's ambitious. Too ambitious." At the time, I brushed it off as fatherly protectiveness. But now, I wish I had listened. Daniel had always been sharper at reading people's intentions. The early signs of Kevin's disdain came dressed as jokes. "Clara, you still balance your checkbook by hand? That's adorable." Or, "Still using that old flip phone? Don't worry, one day we'll drag you into the 21st century." He said these things with a laugh, as if mocking me was harmless fun, but each word chipped away at something inside me. Rachel laughed along, maybe to keep the peace, maybe because she'd learned that disagreeing with him wasn't worth the fight. But what cut the deepest wasn't Kevin's arrogance. It was her silence. My daughter, the little girl who once ran into my arms crying when a teacher teased her, now stood by while her husband made me feel small. After Daniel passed, things worsened. The house, the home we had built together over 40 years, became the center of attention. Kevin wasted no time making suggestions. "You know, Clara, this house is a lot for you to manage alone. The taxes, the maintenance. Wouldn't it make sense to sell and move somewhere easier? Rachel and I could help with the process. Maybe even take it off your hands." Off my hands. Like it was some burden, some object I had no right to hold on to. The same house where I had cooked thousands of meals, planted flowers along the garden path, and nursed Daniel through his final illness. I remember staring at him, holding my tongue. My instinct was to scream, "This is my home, not yours." But grief has a way of dulling your defenses. At that time, I was still waking up at night expecting to hear Daniel's voice. I didn't have the strength to fight battles with Kevin. Rachel echoed his words later, gently, as though repeating them softer would make them kind. Mum, maybe Kevin's right. It's just a lot of work for you now. You deserve a place that's easier. What I heard was, you don't belong here anymore. And so, the pattern continued. Kevin criticizing my old-fashioned ways, Rachel smoothing things over. Both of them quietly circling the house, like vultures waiting for the last heartbeat of independence to fade so they could swoop in. The wheelchair only added fuel to their fire. At first, Kevin pretended concern. Are the doorways wide enough for you? Maybe we should think about remodeling. Though honestly, wouldn't it be simpler if you found a place built for accessibility? He said it with that same tight smile, framing his insult as practicality. I thanked him politely, but inside, the message was clear. You don't fit here anymore. We're just waiting for you to leave. It wasn't only the house. It was holidays, too. Easter brunch that used to be at my table shifted to their home. Thanksgiving dinners, once filled with Daniel's laughter carving the turkey, now centered around Kevin's long speeches about his latest investments. When I asked if I could host Christmas last year, Rachel's excuse came quick. Mum, you know it's just easier at our place now. Less stress for you. Less stress. More control. That's what it was. Control. The grandchildren were my only reprieve. They adored me, untouched by the poison of their father's arrogance. When they ran into my arms, I felt whole again, reminded of what love without judgment feels like. But even there, Kevin managed to intrude. He corrected me when I told them stories, rolling his eyes as though my memories were outdated fairy tales. Grandma exaggerates. He'd chuckle, undermining me in front of the little ones. It all built slowly, like a storm forming on the horizon. I kept telling myself it was grief making me sensitive, that I was imagining the cruelty. But deep down, I knew. Kevin didn't see me as family. He saw me as an obstacle, a reminder that the house he wanted so badly didn't yet belong to him. That night when he mocked my wheelchair, when Rachel looked away instead of standing up for me, that was no slip of the tongue. That was the mask slipping completely. It was Kevin finally saying out loud what he had been showing me all along. I wasn't welcome. But he was wrong about one thing. I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. Not this time. Daniel had prepared for this, in ways Kevin couldn't begin to imagine. And soon, the man who laughed at my chair would find himself speechless, sitting across from a lawyer who held the truth in black and white. And when that truth was read aloud, in front of Rachel, in front of him, in front of everyone, they'd finally learn that I wasn't a burden to erase. I was the owner of everything they thought was theirs. I wish I could tell you that night was just another dinner, one of those evenings where small slights slip through and fade with time. But it wasn't. It was the night Kevin stopped pretending. Rachel had insisted I come over for family photos with the grandchildren. I hesitated at first. I knew how Kevin looked at me, how his lips curled when my chair scraped against their polished hardwood floors. But the thought of seeing the children, of being in pictures they might look back on one day, pulled me in. I remember the smell of rosemary chicken when I wheeled myself into their dining room. The table was immaculate. Rachel always had that perfectionist streak. The silverware lined up as if soldiers, the napkins folded neatly in a way I never quite mastered. The children rushed toward me, hugging my arms, their laughter a balm against the unease I already felt settling in my stomach. Kevin's voice cut through the joy almost immediately. "Careful, kids," he said with a half smile. "Grandma's chair takes up a lot of space." A joke to him, but to me, a reminder that my presence was always framed as an inconvenience. We sat down to eat, and I stayed quiet, listening more than speaking, the way I often did now. Kevin dominated the conversation as usual, talking about his new promotion, how he was networking with executives, how Rachel had finally convinced him to look at beach houses for vacations. My daughter nodded and smiled like a shadow orbiting his light. Her once bright spirit dimmed under his pride. When the plates were cleared, Rachel brought out her camera. "Okay, everyone, let's get a nice family picture." The kids jumped up eagerly, and I maneuvered my chair toward the side, careful not to block anyone. I thought maybe, just maybe, Kevin would let this moment pass without a jab. But as Rachel lifted the camera, he leaned back, smirked, and said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, as though his cruelty was something to be shared. "Don't bring your wheelchair to our house. It ruins the photos." The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, the room went silent. And I swear, even the children paused, looking around, sensing the shift. Then Rachel gave a nervous little laugh, as though smoothing over spilled milk instead of spilled dignity. I froze. My face burned hot, my fingers tightening on the armrests. My heart hammered in my chest, but my throat locked shut. I wanted to speak, to shout, to tell him he had no right. But the weight of Rachel's silence crushed me harder than Kevin's words. That was the worst part. Not his mockery, but her choice to let it pass. My daughter, the girl who once clutched my hand when she was afraid of thunderstorms, who once promised, "I'll always take care of you, Mum," now stood frozen, unwilling to defend me from a man who reduced me to nothing more than an inconvenience. The camera clicked. A flash. Smiles forced onto faces, though mine never came. I sat stiffly in the frame, my humiliation captured forever. Afterward, Kevin clapped his hands together. "Well, that's done," he said cheerfully. "Maybe next time we'll do a photo session somewhere more fitting." He glanced at my chair with a grin. "You know, without the extra furniture?" Rachel hushed him under her breath. But the damage was done. Dinner ended soon after. I barely touched the cake Rachel served. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a heaviness in my chest that no sweetness could ease. The children, bless their innocence, tugged at my sleeve, asking if I'd come for their school play next month. I promised I would, forcing a smile I didn't feel. When the night finally wound down, Rachel hugged me briefly at the door. "Thanks for coming, Mum," she said softly. Her eyes flickered. Guilty, maybe, but not enough to undo her silence. Kevin stood behind her, arms crossed, already looking past me. "Take care, Clara," he added smoothly, as though he hadn't just dismantled my dignity piece by piece. Outside, the air was cool, crisp, with the early evening breeze. I waited for the cab in their driveway, the glow from their windows behind me. From inside came the muffled sound of laughter, of glasses clinking, of life continuing without me. I felt smaller than I had in years. Smaller than the girl who grew up on a farm with hand-me-down shoes. Smaller than the woman who scraped together pennies with Daniel to build our first home. As the cab pulled up, I caught my reflection in the car window. Silver hair, tired eyes, a woman in a chair she never asked for. For a fleeting second, I saw what Kevin saw. Weakness, inconvenience, something to be hidden. But as the cab carried me away, something shifted. His words echoed in my mind, sharp and cruel. "You ruin the photos." And then, layered beneath, came Daniel's voice from years ago, steady and sure. "This house will always be yours, Clara. I'll make sure of it." That memory clung to me like a lifeline. Daniel had been a planner, meticulous in every detail. He knew life could turn cruel. He knew people's true natures revealed themselves when money or power was at stake. If he had suspected Kevin's arrogance, Rachel's weakness, what had he done to protect me? By the time the cab reached my small rented apartment, humiliation had hardened into something sharper. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Resolve. Kevin thought he had stripped me of my worth with one careless laugh. Rachel thought silence was easier than standing up, but they had forgotten. I was not just a frail old woman in a chair. I was the wife of a man who had prepared for everything, who had spent his life ensuring I would never be powerless. And if Kevin believed I would sit quietly while he mocked me in my own family's home, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I didn't sleep much after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Kevin's laugh, that sharp, careless tone echoing through my bones. "Don't bring your wheelchair. It ruins the photos." I replayed it over and over, dissecting every detail. But what haunted me more than the words was Rachel's silence. She had always been my anchor. Even as a child, she was protective. I remember when she was 10 years old, and some boys at school mocked me for bringing cupcakes, with frosting that looked messy. Rachel had stood tall, hands on her hips, declaring, "My mom makes the best cupcakes in the world. Yours taste like cardboard." That was my girl. Bold, loyal, ready to fight for me. But that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who bowed her head when her husband sneered, who chose convenience over courage. And for the first time, I realized the distance between us wasn't just growing, it had become a canyon. The next morning, I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the lace tablecloth I'd had for years. My hands traced the patterns, but my mind was far away, replaying conversations with Daniel. Daniel, my rock. Even now, 3 years after his passing, his voice lived in me. He had always been a planner, almost annoyingly so. He kept neat binders for taxes, labelled folders for property deeds, meticulous notes about everything from mortgage payments to insurance policies. "You'll thank me one day, Clara," he'd say with a chuckle when I teased him about his paper kingdom. And now I did thank him. Silently, because somewhere in that mountain of paperwork, somewhere in the legacy he left behind, I began to suspect there was an answer. That night, when Kevin mocked me in front of my own grandchildren, I thought about one thing: the house. The house they acted like was theirs. The house Daniel and I built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, over decades of sacrifice. The house where every wall carried the memory of our life together. Kevin had always circled it like a hawk. His comments weren't new. "You should downsize, Clara," he'd say, shaking his head like he was doing me a favor. "This house is too much for you." Or, "Rachel and I could put it to better use. It'd be an investment, not a burden." The word burden always caught in my throat. That was how he saw me too. But Daniel had been firm. I remembered one evening, about 6 months before his heart gave out. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. He had leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "Clara, don't you worry about this house. It'll be yours, no matter what." At the time, I didn't question it. Of course it would be mine. We bought it together. But the way he said it, the weight in his tone, it came back to me now. Daniel knew. Somehow he must have known the kind of man Kevin was, the way greed could twist family into strangers. My heart began to beat faster. What if? What if Kevin didn't actually own what he thought he did? What if Rachel was too blinded by him to realize? What if Daniel had set something in motion to protect me? I pushed back from the table, my wheelchair creaking against the floor, and rolled toward the cabinet where I kept a box of Daniel's old papers. My hands shook as I lifted the lid, the familiar smell of paper and ink rising up. Birth certificates, old insurance policies, letters we'd written to each other during our younger years, and tucked near the bottom, the envelope I had nearly forgotten about. Harrison and Cole Law Firm was printed neatly on the front. My breath caught. Harrison, our lawyer, the one who had helped us buy the house 40 years ago, the one Daniel trusted with everything legal. I slid the envelope open and pulled out a neatly folded letter, Daniel's handwriting scrawled across the page. "Clara," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to explain it myself. But I need you to remember one thing. You are safe. The house is safe. I made sure of it. Tears blurred the words, but I kept reading, my hands trembling. I know Rachel loves you, but she's easily swayed. And Kevin, I've seen the way he talks about money, about assets. He doesn't see people, Clara. He sees numbers. I couldn't rest knowing you might one day be pushed out of the home we built. So I've worked with Harrison to make sure that won't happen. The details are with him. Promise me you'll go to him if you ever feel uncertain. I pressed the letter against my chest, my heart pounding. Daniel had known. He had seen it coming. Every piece of it. Suddenly, Kevin's smug laughter replayed in my mind in a new light. He wasn't laughing because he owned everything. He was laughing because he thought he did. And the thought of him being wrong, of him being blindsided by the truth Daniel left behind, lit a spark inside me. The humiliation I had felt only days earlier began to shift into something else. Not rage, not despair. Something stronger. A quiet strength that came from knowing the fight wasn't over. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its envelope. The very next morning, I would call Harrison's office. If Daniel had left something in writing, if he had secured this house for me, then Kevin was about to learn that mocking an old woman in a wheelchair was the biggest mistake of his life. I placed the envelope on the table, staring at it as though it were a shield. For years, I had let them chip away at my dignity with silence. But now, I had Daniel's words, Daniel's plan, and my own resolve. The next time I rolled into that house, it would not be as a burden. It would be as the rightful owner. And when the truth came out, I swore to myself, it wouldn't just be whispered in a lawyer's office. It would be read out loud, in front of Kevin, in front of Rachel, in front of anyone who ever thought I was powerless. The morning after I found Daniel's letter, I hardly slept. My hands ached from arthritis, but I didn't care. My mind was racing too fast. The envelope sat on the table beside my teacup like a living thing, its presence heavy with promise. Every time I glanced at Daniel's handwriting, I felt him with me. His planning, his foresight, his protection. By 8 o'clock sharp, I had my coat on and my handbag in my lap. I dialed for a cab and told the driver to take me downtown. The ride was quiet, but inside me, everything churned. Fear, hope, anger. What if I was wrong? What if Kevin really had taken everything, and all Daniel left me was false comfort? The thought burned in my chest. But then I pictured Kevin's smug grin, his laugh as he dismissed me in front of my grandchildren, and I tightened my grip on the envelope. But then I pictured Kevin's smug grin, his laugh as he dismissed me in front of my grandchildren, and I tightened my grip on the envelope. Number Daniel wouldn't have left me defenseless. When we pulled up in front of Harrison and Cole, the brick building looked the same as it had 40 years ago when Daniel and I first walked in to sign papers for our home. A plaque by the door read, Harrison Fitzgerald, Esquire. I remembered him well. Calm voice, kind eyes. A man who always made us feel like people, not just clients. I wheeled myself inside, the receptionist's smile warm as she asked if I had an appointment. No, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But please tell Mr. Fitzgerald that Clara Williams is here. He'll know my name. Her eyes flickered in recognition, and within minutes I was being ushered into a large office lined with bookshelves. The man who rose from behind the desk was older now, his hair completely silver, but those same kind eyes shone behind his glasses. Clara, he said warmly, extending his hand. It's been far too long. I was wondering when you'd come in. The words jolted me, wondering when I'd come in. I wasn't sure if I should, I stammered. But I found this. I slid the envelope across the desk. Daniel left it. He said you'd have the details. Mr. Fitzgerald adjusted his glasses and unfolded the letter, reading it silently. His expression softened, and he nodded slowly. Yes, Daniel came to see me about this very matter 6 months before he passed. He was concerned. He wanted to ensure you were protected no matter what. My throat tightened. Protected from who? His gaze met mine, knowing and gentle. From anyone who might try to take what was yours. He was particularly worried about your son-in-law. He said Kevin was ambitious and not always respectful. I let out a shaky laugh. Ambitious is a polite word for it. He smiled faintly, then reached for a thick folder on his desk. Daniel updated his will. It was filed properly, witnessed, notarized. Everything is airtight. He left you the house. Outright, Clara. In fact, he was very specific. This property, every brick and beam, belongs solely to you. It cannot be transferred, sold, or claimed by anyone else without your consent. Not Rachel, not Kevin. No one. The room swam for a moment. Relief, so sharp it was almost painful, surged through me. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair as I tried to steady myself. So, it's mine? I whispered. It's always been yours, he said firmly. Daniel wanted you to feel secure, no matter what anyone else said. You are the sole legal owner of 417 Maplewood Lane. I closed my eyes, tears threatening to spill. Daniel had kept his promise. He had protected me, even from beyond the grave. Mr. Fitzgerald cleared his throat and leaned forward. But that's not all. Daniel anticipated that Rachel, or more likely Kevin, might attempt to manipulate you. He added a clause, Clara. A very unusual one, but legally binding. My heart pounded. What kind of clause? He opened the will, his finger tracing the paragraph. In the event that Rachel or her spouse should show gross disrespect or mistreatment toward you following Daniel's death, they forfeit any secondary claims to the estate. The house, the assets, everything reverts entirely to you. It's a protection clause. Daniel said, and I quote, "I don't want Clara to ever feel like a burden in her own home." The words broke me. I pressed a hand to my mouth as a sob slipped out. For months, I had carried Kevin's insults like stones on my back. For months, I had felt small and weak. But Daniel, oh Daniel, he had seen it all coming. He had built me a fortress, brick by brick, in the language of law. Mr. Fitzgerald's voice softened. Clara, your son-in-law mocking you in your own home, humiliating you in front of your family. This qualifies. If we wanted to press the matter, we could declare them trespassers immediately. The law is on your side. Trespassers. The word rolled through me like a bell. Kevin, standing there smug and confident, mocking me. Trespasser. Rachel, silent while he chipped away at me. Trespasser. The house wasn't theirs. It was mine. It had always been mine. What do I do now? I asked, my voice barely steady. He smiled gently, but there was steel in his eyes. You let me handle the paperwork. There will be an official reading of the will next week for formality's sake, and I would encourage you to attend, Clara. Not quietly, not tucked away. Attend as the rightful owner. Let Kevin hear the truth from my lips, in front of witnesses. Let him learn what trespassing really means. For the first time in years, I felt something rise inside me. Not just relief, not just safety. Power. Kevin had thought he was clever, laughing at me, diminishing me. But in just a week's time, he would be the one shrinking in his chair, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of Daniel's words. I wheeled myself out of Harrison's office that day, taller than I had walked in years. My body might be bound to this chair, but my spirit, it stood taller than ever. And I promised myself, when the truth came out, I wouldn't whisper. I would sit in silence, strong and steady, and let Daniel's will speak louder than Kevin's cruelty ever could. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of Harrison closing that thick folder with a firm snap. To me, it wasn't just paper. It was a weapon, sharper than anything Kevin could have imagined. On the bus ride home, I couldn't stop replaying every word the lawyer had said. The house is yours. solely yours. They are trespassers without your consent. Each phrase felt like balm against every cruel remark. Every time Kevin had dismissed me as useless, every silence Rachel had offered instead of defense. For so long, I had carried the weight of believing I was dependent on their goodwill. I thought my presence in that house, the home I had helped build, was tolerated at best, a temporary kindness they could revoke when it no longer suited them. But Daniel had been planning for this battle long before I even knew there was one. He had left me not just a home, but dignity, protection, power. When I reached my apartment, I set Daniel's letter on the table beside a framed photo of us on our wedding day. I studied his face, young, strong, smiling, and whispered, "You knew, didn't you? You saw it coming." My fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "And you made sure they couldn't take me down, not even when you were gone." That night, I dreamed of the house, its creaking floors, the smell of lavender from the garden, Daniel's laugh echoing in the halls. I dreamed of Kevin standing in the doorway, sneering, telling me I didn't belong. But in the dream, Harrison's voice thundered back, "Trespasser." Kevin's smirk melted. Rachel turned pale. And I, sitting steady in my chair, finally exhaled. When I awoke, I felt lighter than I had in years. But as the week crawled forward, the weight of betrayal pressed heavier on my chest. Rachel had to have known something. Maybe not the claws, maybe not the details, but she knew Kevin was circling me like prey. She had watched him chip at me for years. She had laughed nervously when he mocked me. She had let silence become her shield while I became their target. I tried to picture Daniel's face if he had seen her that night, standing there while Kevin told me not to bring my wheelchair into their house. Would he have been angrier at Kevin's cruelty, or at Rachel's failure to speak? The truth stung. I loved my daughter. But in that moment, I didn't trust her. She had chosen Kevin's comfort over my dignity, and for that, she would have to hear the truth the same way he did, out loud, in a lawyer's office, with no way to deny it. 3 days before the reading, I received a phone call. Rachel's voice came soft, hesitant. "Mom, are you coming to dinner this weekend? The kids would love to see you." There it was, the polite invitation, neatly worded, as though nothing had happened, as though Kevin's words hadn't sliced through me like a knife, as though she hadn't sat there, laughing nervously, while my humiliation was sealed into family photos. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice calm. "No, Rachel, I'll see you soon enough." There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear her frowning. "Are you sure? Kevin was just joking the other night. He didn't mean anything." There it was again. Excuses. Always excuses. "He meant it," I said simply. "And so did you, when you said nothing." The silence stretched so long I thought she might hang up. Then she muttered, "We'll talk later," and ended the call. I stared at the phone in my hand, my pulse steady. Once those words, "he didn't mean anything," might have soothed me, convinced me to forgive, to smooth things over. But not anymore. Daniel's voice echoed in my head. "I don't want Clara to ever feel like a burden in her own home." The day of the reading arrived like a storm on the horizon. I wore my best navy dress, the one Daniel always said made my eyes look brighter. I pinned my silver hair carefully, sat tall in my chair, and took a deep breath before wheeling into the cab. Harrison's office was filled with the faint scent of leather and polished wood. The conference room table gleamed beneath the overhead lights. And when Rachel and Kevin arrived, Rachel in a pale blouse, Kevin in his expensive suit, the air shifted. Kevin smirked as he took his seat, leaning back as though he owned the room. Rachel avoided my eyes. "Well," Kevin said cheerfully, tapping the table, "let's get this formality over with. We already know what it says." Harrison's gaze flicked to me, then back to them. He folded his hands neatly over the folder. That's precisely why we're here, to make sure everyone understands exactly what Daniel left behind. I sat in silence, my heart steady, my fingers folded in my lap. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a burden. Kevin thought this was his stage, his show. He thought he was about to receive validation of all his arrogance. But he didn't know what was written in that folder. He didn't know about Daniel's meticulous foresight, the clause, the airtight protection. And as Harrison cleared his throat and began to read, I felt Daniel's presence settle over me like a shield. This wasn't just paperwork. This was justice. Justice my husband had prepared long before Kevin's laughter filled our dining room. And within minutes, Kevin's smirk would vanish. Rachel's excuses would crumble, and the truth would shatter every illusion they had built around themselves. Harrison's voice was calm, steady, as he began reviewing Daniel's will clause by clause. I kept my eyes fixed on Kevin, watching his smug expression flicker with the smallest twitch of impatience. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee like a man already certain of his victory. Rachel sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me once. That hurt more than anything else. Her refusal to meet my eyes, as though she already knew she had failed me. Daniel James Williams, Harrison read, his voice clear. Being of sound mind and body, does hereby bequeath his primary residence, located at 417 Maplewood Lane, including all furnishings and personal property therein, to his beloved wife, Clara Ann Williams. The words dropped into the room like stones in water. For a moment, Kevin blinked, as though he hadn't heard correctly. Rachel's lips parted in a tiny gasp, her eyes darting toward me before she quickly looked away. But Harrison wasn't finished. He adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice deliberate. Furthermore, in the event that Clara Williams should be disrespected, mistreated, or pressured regarding said property following my death, all secondary claims to the estate by Rachel Hayes and her spouse, Kevin Hayes, shall be revoked in perpetuity. The silence was deafening. My pulse roared in my ears. I could almost hear Daniel's voice echoing in that room, protective and firm. She is never to be treated as a burden. Kevin's smirk collapsed. His foot dropped heavily to the floor, and for the first time, he sat upright. That can't be right, he stammered, his voice rising. Rachel is his daughter. I'm his son-in-law. Of course, the house was meant for us eventually. Harrison's eyes narrowed, his tone turning sharp. What the will says, Mr. Hayes, is what stands. And what stands is that Clara Williams is the sole legal owner of the house. Any attempt to claim otherwise will be considered trespassing. The word hit him like a slap. Trespassing. Rachel's face drained of colour. Mum, she whispered, finally meeting my eyes. There was pleading in her gaze, but also guilt. She knew, maybe not the exact wording, but she knew Daniel wouldn't have left me vulnerable. And still, she had stood by Kevin's side. Kevin's hand slammed against the table. This is absurd. He didn't mean for her to live alone in that house. It's too much for her. She can't manage it. I sat straighter in my chair, my voice calm but unwavering. I've managed a house, a marriage, and a child for over 40 years, Kevin. I'll manage this too. His mouth opened, then closed, as though he had no response to that. Harrison cleared his throat, shuffling papers back into the folder. The terms are binding, and let me be perfectly clear. Daniel anticipated potential challenges. This document has been reviewed and notarized by witnesses. It is ironclad. Any attempt to undermine it will not only fail, but it may open the door to legal consequences. Kevin's face twisted with frustration, but Harrison didn't let him speak. He closed the folder with finality. The will stands as written. This house belongs to Clara. You may continue living there only at her discretion. Otherwise, legally speaking, you are trespassing. I looked at Kevin then. Really looked. The man who had laughed at me days earlier, mocking my wheelchair, mocking my existence, was now pale, jaw tight, his confidence slipping through his fingers like sand. It was almost poetic. Rachel's hands trembled on the table. "Mum, please. Kevin didn't mean—" I cut her off, my voice steady. "He meant every word. And so did you, when you said nothing." Her eyes filled with tears. But I didn't waver. The betrayal ran too deep. When we left Harrison's office, Kevin stormed ahead, his shoulders tight with anger. Rachel trailed behind, her silence heavier than before. I remained in the conference room for a few moments longer, watching the light fall across the polished wood table. My heart beat steadily. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt protected. Harrison placed a hand gently on the back of my chair. "Clara, I know this is difficult, but you must understand. This is not only your legal right, it is your shield. Daniel wanted you to use it." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I will, Harrison. I promise." That night, I returned to my small apartment. But the air felt different. I no longer felt like a woman exiled from her home. I was the rightful owner, the one who held the keys, the one with the law on her side. Kevin and Rachel could dress their betrayal in excuses, but the truth was in black and white. Over the next few days, I began planning, not just for the official confrontation, but for what would follow. Harrison advised me to document everything: Kevin's insults, Rachel's complicity, the way they treated me as an outsider in the very house I built. "If this escalates," he said, "it's best to have evidence." So I started writing. Every comment, every silence, every humiliating moment I had endured. I wrote it down in a notebook, my hands aching but my resolve firm. Each page was a reminder. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't weak. I had been disrespected, and Daniel had given me the tools to fight back. Kevin still believed he could outmaneuver me. I could see it in his eyes at the grocery store when we crossed paths. He smirked, muttering something under his breath as he pushed his cart past mine, Rachel following quietly behind. But his arrogance was his weakness. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought my chair meant defeat. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't waiting quietly. I was waiting patiently. And when the moment came, when Harrison's words rang out in front of family, neighbors, and anyone else who had ever doubted me, Kevin Hayes would learn the cost of underestimating the woman he mocked. If I thought the meeting at Harrison's office would humble Kevin, I was wrong. Men like him don't crumble at the first sign of defeat. They double down. And that's exactly what he did. 2 days after the will reading, I went back to the house to gather some of Daniel's old belongings I had left behind. I half expected the locks to be changed. Instead, I found Kevin on the porch with 2 contractors, waving blueprints like a general preparing for war. "This wall comes down," he was saying, his voice carrying across the yard. "We'll open up the space for a modern kitchen. And this," he jabbed at the paper with his pen, "this study will make a perfect wine cellar. My wife and I want a full tasting room, not some dusty old office." My chest tightened. Daniel's study, his sanctuary, the room where he wrote letters, pored over plans, where he recorded every detail of his life so meticulously. A wine cellar. To Kevin, it was nothing more than wasted square footage. I wheeled myself closer, my presence startling the contractors. Kevin turned, his jaw tightening before curling into a mock smile. "Clara, didn't know you were coming." I held his gaze. "This is still my house, Kevin. You don't make changes without me." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Your house?" "Clara, come on. We both know you can't manage a place like this anymore. Rachel and I are just trying to make it functional. Besides," he gestured at the contractors, "this is progress. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word struck me like a slap. One of the contractors glanced at me nervously, then back at Kevin. Mr. Hayes, should we? Kevin waved them off. Take a break. We'll reconvene later. They shuffled away, leaving us alone on the porch. I steadied my voice. Kevin? I was at Harrison's office. I heard Daniel's will read aloud. This house is mine. Solely mine. The renovations you're planning aren't yours to make. His smile disappeared. Don't play games, Clara. You're 72 years old, in a wheelchair, living in a cramped apartment. Do you really think you can maintain this place? Do you think you belong here? I didn't flinch. Belong? I built this home with Daniel. Every wall, every nail, every flower in the garden has my hand in it. You walked into something I already made. For a moment, his composure cracked. His jaw clenched, and he leaned down, his voice low and venomous. Let me be very clear. Rachel and I are the future of this family. Not you. You're the past. The paperwork doesn't change the truth. I met his stare, my voice sharp as steel. The paperwork is the truth. He straightened, his lips twisting into a bitter smirk. We'll see. Inside, the grandchildren ran through the halls, their laughter echoing. For them, none of this mattered. They didn't see ownership, wills, or legal clauses. They just saw home. And that made my resolve harden further. I wouldn't let Kevin take that from them. Or from me. That night, I wrote everything down in my notebook. The contractors, the blueprints, his words. Harrison had told me to document, and I did. Every sneer, every insult, every move Kevin made to erase me from the life Daniel and I built. A week later, I received an invitation. A family gathering, hosted at their house. Rachel's handwriting, careful and polite. At the bottom, Kevin had scrawled a note. Don't worry, Clara. We'll make sure there's space for your chair. Mockery disguised as courtesy. I almost didn't go. The humiliation of the last dinner still clung to me like smoke. But then I thought of Daniel's letter, of Harrison's steady voice reading the will. I thought of the clause, any disrespect or mistreatment shall revoke their claim in perpetuity. And I realized, this wasn't just about dignity. It was about exposure. So I went. When I arrived, the house was filled with guests, neighbors, friends, even some of Kevin's colleagues. They filled the living room with chatter, wine glasses in hand, admiring Rachel's decorations. Kevin moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, boasting about renovations in progress. He spoke as if he were lord of the manor, the house his crown. But I noticed the way some neighbors glanced at me with pity, whispering behind their hands. They had seen how Kevin treated me. They had heard his jabs. They knew, even if Rachel pretended otherwise, dinner was much the same. Kevin's voice dominating, Rachel smiling tightly, me sitting quietly at the end of the table. But this time, I didn't let the humiliation seep into my bones. I held Daniel's letter in my mind like a shield. And when Kevin made yet another crack about how maybe Clara should downsize into something more her speed, like a retirement unit, I didn't flinch. I simply noted the gasps from a few guests, the awkward silence that followed, the way Rachel's face turned pink with shame. He thought he was invincible. He thought my silence was surrender. But in just a few days, when Harrison read the will aloud in front of witnesses, Kevin's arrogance would crumble. He would be exposed not just as disrespectful, but as a man trespassing in a home that had never belonged to him. And this time, the laughter wouldn't be at my expense. It would be his silence everyone remembered. The conference room was packed tighter than I expected. Harrison had invited not only Rachel and Kevin, but also a handful of witnesses from the community. Neighbors, Daniel's old business partner, even a distant cousin or two. He said it was for clarity. But I knew the truth. He wanted no room for Kevin to twist this later. The long oak table gleamed under the light. I wheeled myself to one end, my hands steady on the armrests. Kevin and Rachel sat across from me. Kevin's tie was knotted a little too tightly, his smile stretched wide, but there was tension in the way his jaw ticked. Rachel kept her eyes on the folder in front of Harrison, her fingers wringing a tissue until it tore. Harrison began with formalities, his voice calm and measured. He spoke of Daniel's character, of his meticulous planning. I caught fragments. Sound mind, last will and testament, duly notarized. My eyes flicked to Kevin, watching as he smirked and whispered something to Rachel. Then Harrison's tone shifted, deliberate and firm. I will now read aloud the provisions of Daniel James Williams's last will and testament regarding the estate at 417 Maplewood Lane. The room quieted. I, Daniel James Williams, hereby leave our primary residence, including all furnishings and personal property within, to my beloved wife, Clara Ann Williams. The words landed like a hammer blow. Gasps rippled through the room. My chest tightened, tears pricking my eyes, but I kept my head high. Kevin's smirk faltered. Wait. What? He leaned forward, his voice sharp. That can't be right. He would never... But Harrison raised a hand. Please allow me to continue. He adjusted his glasses, his voice cutting through the tension. Furthermore, I hereby stipulate that in the event my wife, Clara, is disrespected, mistreated, or pressured regarding said property following my death, all secondary claims to the estate by my daughter, Rachel Hayes, and her spouse, Kevin Hayes, shall be revoked permanently. The silence that followed was so thick it was almost suffocating. I heard someone shift uncomfortably at the back of the room. Rachel's face drained of colour. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Kevin's hands clenched into fists on the table. "This is outrageous!" he snapped finally, his voice rising. "This house was meant for us. Daniel told Rachel, he promised her." Harrison's voice was calm, steady as stone. "The will is clear, Mr. Hayes. Daniel's intentions are written, signed, and legally binding. The property belongs solely to Clara Williams. Any occupancy by others without her permission constitutes trespassing." The word echoed like thunder. Trespassing. Kevin let out a short, bitter laugh, though his voice cracked around the edges. Trespassing? In my own home? I leaned forward, my voice calm, clear enough for every ear in the room. "It was never your home, Kevin. Not for a single day." Murmurs rippled among the witnesses. Daniel's cousin shook her head slowly. Her lips pursed. One of the neighbours leaned toward another, whispering, "I knew it. I always said he treated her terribly." Kevin's face reddened. "Rachel, say something," he barked, turning to my daughter. "Tell them what your father told you. Tell them this isn't what he meant." Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. She shook her head weakly. I don't know what to say." I felt the ache in my chest ease, replaced by something stronger. Sadness, yes, but also vindication. For months, I had carried humiliation like a cloak. Now the weight was lifting. Kevin slammed his palm against the table, rattling the glasses of water. "This is a trick. An old man's paranoia. It won't hold up." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "It will hold up in any court of law." Daniel was thorough. His intentions were explicit. "And I'll remind you, Mr. Hayes, mocking or dismissing Clara in this setting only proves his foresight." Gasps. A murmur of agreement. Someone even chuckled softly. Kevin froze, realizing his own outburst had just underlined the very clause that stripped him of everything. Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, is this really what Dad wanted?" I looked straight at her, my voice soft but unyielding. "Yes. He wanted me to be safe. He wanted me to never feel like a burden in the home we built together. And you let your husband make me one." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached for Kevin's arm, but he shook her off, his face twisted in fury. Harrison closed the folder, his tone final. The matter is settled. Clara Williams is the sole owner of the property. Kevin, Rachel, you have no legal claim. If you remain in the house without Clara's consent, you will be trespassing, subject to removal by law enforcement. The word hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Trespassing. Kevin's lips curled, but for once, no words came. The silence that followed was almost sweeter than the declaration itself. For the first time, I saw him speechless, stripped of his arrogance. I sat there in my chair, spine straight, eyes steady. My wheelchair didn't ruin the photos. His cruelty did. And now, in front of everyone, it was his silence that would be remembered, not my shame. When the room finally emptied, I wheeled myself to the window, sunlight spilling across my lap. For the first time in months, I felt Daniel's promise fulfilled. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't powerless. I was the rightful owner of my home, and Kevin Hayes had been reduced to nothing more than a guest overstaying his welcome. No, worse than a guest. A trespasser. The room was still heavy with silence after Harrison closed the folder. The words trespassing and revoked permanently lingered in the air like a final verdict. I sat still, my breath steady, watching Kevin squirm under the weight of Daniel's foresight. But men like Kevin don't surrender gracefully. He couldn't leave the silence intact. He had to claw at it, to twist it into something that kept him in control. "This is absurd," he said finally, his voice louder than necessary, aimed at the witnesses who were already gathering their coats. "Daniel must have been manipulated. He wasn't in his right mind when he wrote that will. Everyone knows it." Heads turned. A few people frowned. One neighbor, Mr. Green, who had known Daniel for decades, spoke up sharply. "Don't you dare speak about Daniel like that. He was sharper than most men half his age. If he wrote it, he meant it." Kevin's face flushed red, but he pressed on. "You all can't seriously believe this. Clara—" He turned on me, his voice dripping false pity. "You don't really want this house all to yourself, do you? You know you can't manage it. Rachel and I were just trying to help you." I sat tall in my chair, my voice steady. "Help me? By mocking me in my own dining room? By planning renovations behind my back? By laughing at my wheelchair as if I were some prop ruining your perfect picture?" Gasps rippled around the table. Gasps rippled around the table. Rachel buried her face in her hands. Kevin's jaw tightened, but I wasn't finished. "You call that help, Kevin? Number that was greed, dressed as kindness. Control, dressed as concern. Daniel saw you for what you are, and he made sure you'd never touch what he and I built." For once, my voice didn't shake. It rang clear, every word cutting through the room like glass. Kevin laughed bitterly, his bravado faltering but not yet broken. "So what, Clara? You're going to throw your own daughter out on the street? That's the kind of mother you are?" Rachel flinched as though struck. Her eyes darted to me, wet and pleading. "Mum, please, don't do this. We're family. We can work this out." I held her gaze, my heart twisting. For a moment, the little girl she once was flickered in her eyes, the one who used to hold my hand in thunderstorms, who whispered, "I'll always protect you, Mummy." But that girl was gone. She had let Kevin's arrogance swallow her voice until silence was all she offered me. "I would never throw family out," I said softly. "But family doesn't treat me like a burden. Family doesn't sit in silence while their husband mocks me. Family doesn't circle the house I built, waiting for me to die so they can claim it." Her tears fell freely now. Kevin shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled that his wife's composure was slipping. He put a hand on her arm, but she jerked away, whispering, "Stop it, Kevin. Just stop." The witnesses murmured louder now. Some shook their heads, others whispered about Daniel's wisdom. I caught the word shameful more than once, and for the first time, it wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed squarely at them. Kevin tried one last time to regain control. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and pointed a finger at Harrison. "This isn't over. We'll contest this. You'll see me in court." Harrison didn't flinch. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Hayes, but I assure you, you will lose. And every attempt you make will only highlight your disrespect toward Clara, further cementing Daniel's claws." In fact, he leaned forward slightly. "If you continue down this road, I may advise Clara to pursue legal damages for emotional distress." The room erupted in low gasps again. Kevin froze, his finger still in the air, his face contorting between rage and fear. For a moment, he seemed ready to explode. But then he saw the eyes on him. Neighbors, colleagues, people he prided himself on impressing. People who would carry this scene with them, whispering about the man who mocked his mother-in-law and was cast as a trespasser in her home. Slowly, he lowered his hand. His shoulders stiffened, his chest heaving as he tried to force a smile back onto his face. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Fine." Rachel sat in silence, tears streaking her cheeks. She didn't defend him anymore. She didn't defend me either. She just stared at the table, as if the wood grain could swallow her whole. When the last witness left, I lingered, letting the weight of the moment settle. Harrison walked me to the door, his hand firm on the back of my chair. "You handled yourself with dignity, Clara," he said quietly. "Daniel would be proud." I nodded, my throat thick. It wasn't dignity, Harrison. It was truth. And for once, the truth was louder than his laughter. As I left the office, the sun struck my face. I felt taller, steadier, even in my chair. Kevin had tried to bury me in humiliation, but now it was him buried under silence, under whispers, under shame. The man who once told me I ruined the photos now stood ruined himself, in the eyes of neighbors, colleagues, and his own wife. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. Daniel's will had spoken for me. The next evening, I was sitting by my window with a cup of tea when I heard the knock. Slow, heavy, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission but demands entry. I wheeled myself to the door and opened it to find Rachel standing there, her face pale and eyes red from crying. Behind her, Kevin loomed, his jaw clenched, his suit jacket unbuttoned like he had stormed out of some meeting straight to my door. "Mum?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." I hesitated, then moved aside. They stepped in, filling my small apartment with their presence. Kevin didn't wait to sit. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his posture defensive but his eyes sharp. Rachel sat on the sofa, twisting her hands. "Mom, please. You don't have to do this. We're family. Dad didn't mean for it to be this way. You know that." I took a slow sip of tea, letting the silence hang before answering. "I know exactly what your father meant, Rachel. He meant to protect me. He meant for me to never feel like a burden. And yesterday, in that room, his words proved he was right to worry." Her face crumpled, tears spilling again. "I was scared," she whispered. He was just joking that night. I didn't know what to say. I looked at her, my heart aching. She was still my daughter, still the girl I had raised, but she was also the woman who had chosen silence when I needed her most. "Silence is a choice, Rachel, and you made yours." Kevin finally spoke, his tone dripping with false charm. "Clara, let's be reasonable. You can't possibly manage that house on your own. Do you really want to live there, rattling around in those empty rooms? It doesn't make sense. Rachel and we're the future. We can take care of it. Take care of you." I turned my eyes on him, steady and cold. "Take care of me? You mocked me. You humiliated me. You told me not to bring my wheelchair into my own home because it ruined your pictures. That's not care, Kevin. That's contempt." His smile faltered. You're twisting things. I was just trying to lighten the mood. No, I said firmly. You were showing me exactly how little respect you have for me, and Daniel saw it long before I did. Rachel reached for my hand, tears running freely. Mom, please, don't shut me out. Don't throw us out. The kids, they love you. They need you. I swallowed hard. That was the only part of this that made my resolve waver. The children, their laughter, their hugs, their innocence. They were the only reason I hadn't turned my back completely. But I thought of the notebook on my table, filled with Kevin's insults, Rachel's silences, the evidence of years of disrespect. I thought of Daniel's voice in that letter. I don't want Clara to ever feel like a burden in her own home. I pulled my hand gently from Rachel's grasp. The children will always have me. But you and Kevin, you've made your choices. And now you live with them. Kevin's face darkened, his voice rising. So what, you'll throw us out? Leave your own daughter on the street? You'll be the villain, Clara, not me. I laughed softly, a sound even I hadn't expected. The villain? Kevin, you did that all by yourself. You laughed at me in front of my grandchildren. You stood in my husband's study and called it wasted space. You brought contractors to tear down the walls we built with our own hands. I don't have to make you a villain. You already are one. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked to Rachel for support, but she sat slumped, silent, broken by the truth she couldn't deny. I wheeled myself closer, my voice low but sharp as a blade. Let me make this perfectly clear. You will leave my house. Not because I am throwing you out, but because you were never welcome there as long as you treated me like less than family. You are a trespasser, Kevin. And if I have to call the police to make that official, I will. For a moment, the only sound was Rachel's quiet sobbing. Kevin's fists clenched, his knuckles white. But he said nothing. He couldn't. Not after Harrison's words, not after Daniel's will, not after his own arrogance had been laid bare for the world to see. Finally, Rachel stood, wiping her tears. She looked at me with a mixture of shame and sorrow. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered. I should have defended you. I don't know why I didn't. I held her gaze, my voice softer now. I know why. Because silence is easier. But easy doesn't mean right. Kevin grabbed her arm, tugging her toward the door. We're done here, he muttered. His voice was sharp, but hollow. As the door closed behind them, I sat in the quiet, my chest rising and falling. My hands shook slightly on the armrests, but not from fear, from release. For the first time in years, I felt like I had stood not just for myself, but for Daniel, for the life we built, for the dignity that no one had the right to strip away. And I realized something then. The house was more than walls and furniture. It was a testament, a reminder that love, respect, and foresight endure even when people fail you. Kevin had laughed at my wheelchair, thinking it ruined the photos. But now, it was his arrogance, his greed, his disrespect that had ruined everything. For him and me, I was no longer the burden in the corner of the room. I was the woman who still held the keys. The day I rolled back into 417 Maplewood Lane, the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, not because the rooms were any less familiar, but because I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. For months, Kevin had strutted through these halls as though they were his stage. For months, Rachel had walked beside him, silent and complicit. And for months, I had sat quietly, shrinking into myself, wondering if I truly belonged. But now I wheeled across the threshold with Daniel's promise holding me tall. The contractors never returned. Kevin's wine cellar dreams dissolved the moment Harrison's words echoed in that conference room. The neighbors who had witnessed his outburst whispered about it for weeks, and the story spread faster than Kevin could smother it. Everywhere he went, In town, at work, even at church, people knew. They knew he had mocked his mother-in-law, and they knew he had been exposed as a trespasser in her home. Rachel came by once more, weeks later, without Kevin. She stood on the porch with the children, her eyes swollen, her voice quiet. "Mum, I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I hope someday we can start over." I looked at my grandchildren, their faces bright with innocence. I invited them in, hugged them tight, listened to their laughter echo through the halls. But when Rachel asked if she could come inside, I shook my head gently. "Not yet. Trust has to be rebuilt, Rachel. And bricks take time." She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, and walked away slowly. It hurt. God, it hurt. But I knew Daniel would want me to stand firm. He had built a shield for me in those pages of legal language, but he had also built a lesson. Love without respect is not love at all. In the weeks that followed, I made the house mine again. I redecorated Daniel's study, not as a wine cellar, but as a small library, filling the shelves with the books he loved and the notebooks I had begun keeping. In the garden, I planted lavender, just as we used to. Its scent carried on the breeze, comforting and familiar. Neighbours began stopping by, not out of pity, but respect. They brought pies, shared stories of Daniel, offered help with small tasks. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. One afternoon, as I sat in the sunroom with the light streaming through the glass, I picked up my notebook and reread the entries. Kevin's insults, Rachel's silences, my own doubts, and finally, the words that had changed everything. Trespassing. I realized then that the house wasn't just proof of Daniel's love. It was proof of my resilience. I had been mocked,